Hey guys, what's up? Joe. What's going on here? The caffeine. I'm actually really liking this dark background shit. I kind of prefer it, to be honest. Now, if I could have some cool like neon lights in the background instead of like flooding my fucking room with a bunch of lights and shit, I mean, probably look better. Also, it hides like my fuck ups. Because, yeah, I don't like the way my background looks because it's all fucked up right now. Because my office is the living room and, yeah, we're moving, so everything in the background looks bad. But in this case, it kind of hides it, so, yeah, I'm liking it. Warp stabilizer or just stabilization, it's massively helpful, right? But like, you kind of have to be careful how you use it because like if you use too much of it, it looks bad. And also another thing is like when you're filming, if you know for a fact you're gonna be using like image stabilization and editing, then obviously you want to make sure you like help the software give you like the best results possible. Because if you're just like filming, right, and you're going all stupid, jittery and all that shit, and like, you know, you're thinking, oh, just use warp stabilizer, it'll be fine. Yeah, no, that's the wrong approach, definitely. You want to make sure you film properly. You can even use like a stabilizer, say like a gimbal, like I do sometimes, and still use that in combination with you know, image stabilization in post, and you get like a better result rather than being hell the whole goddamn time. Yeah, don't rely on image stabilization 100% of the time because you're gonna get bad results, right? Now, if you don't know the difference, like when you say like warp stabilizer, basically all that's gonna do is gonna like pretend like your fucking footage becomes jello. It gets molded to be stabilized, right? That's what it's called, warp stabilization, right? And like if it's too extreme, that's when you see like the shit like jiggle too much because it's being stabilized too much, it gets distorted. So when you want, that's why I'm saying like when you're filming something and you know for a fact you're gonna be using image stabilization, you want to hold it as steady as possible before you drop it in post, and then you add the stabilization because or else you're gonna get that jello effect. So this is without the stabilizer. You can see how jittery it looks, you know, pause handheld stuff, and now you can see with the stabilization how it looks, right? But you can kind of see in the background everything looks kind of weird, like you can see, like it looks wavy, but you can see like the overall image, it looks a lot stabilizer, and then it goes back to not being stabilized. See the difference? That's in Premiere Pro, right? All right, now we're gonna go to DaVinci, and I'm gonna finish off the rest of the video with DaVinci. Now, if I was to like, now the cool thing about DaVinci, and I feel it's better, is that like, well, one, I don't have to drop in any filter, right? Basically, what you have to do is like, you know, you select the clip itself, and then you have all this, the inspector bar over here. And then you already have like a stabilization tab. You can hit stabilize, it analyzes everything for you, and there you go, it's done, right? But there is some problems when you do that, and like there's a reason why I pick these clips here. One is Paul holding up some screws here and handheld, and like you know, I picked this because we're close to a product, right? So the hands are gonna be jittery because I had to zoom in. And also this part right here, plus holding like a fan that's gonna start to the back of the case, and you know there's like zooming out because I had to like step back a bit, then I zoom in, right? So I'm gonna show you how the warp stabilization, how the stabilizer works in these scenarios, right? And then this is my footage where I went to Knott's Berry Farm. When I went to Knott's Berry Farm, I used my phone, right? And it was all a handheld, so I was walking, I was doing this shit, right? Now, my phone does have like a built-in image stabilization that I did use, but I used that in combination with DaVinci, and it did a good job, right? But there's a reason why it did a good job, and I'm going to get to that. So if we go back to our screen here, I'm going to start with this clip. Now, if you can see here, it's okay. If anything, like by itself, it would have been fine. Like I zoom in here, there's a very, very little jitter, you know, pause, you know, fingers. I mean, this image by itself is pretty good, right? I did a good job of holding it, but if I wanted to do like the little extra step to stabilize this, then I can select this, I can go over to stabilization. Now, you have three options here, right? Perspective, similarity, and translation. Now, if you don't know the difference, let me just pull up this guy here. So from here, when you have the pull down menu, you're gonna have three options, right? You got perspective, similarities, and translation, right? Perspective is similar to warp stabilizer, like in Premiere Pro, right? Basically, that's where it kind of morphs. It does bend the image, almost like that wavy jello look, to make sure everything looks less jittery, right? So you kind of have more of that bending look when you use perspective. Similarity, basically, it's gonna do everything, the rotation, the tilt, and pan, and all that good stuff, but it's not gonna do any warp stabilization, right? It's gonna move the footage around, but you're not gonna get that jello look because nothing's gonna get bended, right? There's no warping. Then translation, it does everything except rotation. So basically what's gonna happen is your image, see my phone is like the video, it's gonna be going like this way just to keep itself stabilized, but there's no rotation. happen when you use translation, right? So that's the different perspective. Is like using the warpage, which creates your video into jello, depending how bad you're moving. Similarity, it it does the rotation, the tilt and pan and all that stuff, but there's no warpage going on. And translation, it does like the tilt and pan, but there's no rotation going on in your images, right? So you have 3 options. All right, so here's the magic. So here's the clip, right? Like I said, sorry, this is fine, right? As you see here, it's looking okay. But obviously, if you want to get a little bit more image stabilization, we can do that. I'm gonna select my footage here, right? Now we're gonna go to the stabilization. Now, here's the thing about this situation. Now the camera's gonna analyze the movement, and most of the movement is gonna be focused around here, right? It's the hand, the finger. It's gonna analyze all that, and it can cause some issues, right? So if I just go by the default, it hit stabilize and see what happens, and see how fast it is. There you go, done. Now as you can see here, if I turn this on and off, see how much it cropped in. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using like stabilization. It's gonna zoom in, because if I turn off the zoom here, you're actually able to see what it does, right? You can start seeing like the warpage, see like the edges. Yeah, this is basically what's happening. Is like probably as the camera is moving, it's gonna like warp everything. You can see how the edges are kind of starting to get skewed and stuff like that. Yeah, that's basically what's happening. Is like the stabilization kind of like crops everything around. It kind of like bends and moves, it rotates and tilts and other good stuff like the footage to stabilize it, right? So that's why we want to have like the zoom here. You can see the background is what looks the most fucked up, right? Now we get like the similarities. This basically does everything that perspective does, just minus the warpage, right? And then the translation does everything minus like the rotation and the warp. So now if you're not familiar with these guys, the strength, the smooth, and the cropping, here's what I'll tell you. In these situations, you actually want to use the least amount of like stabilization possible so it won't get too distracting and doesn't look too distorted, right? Sometimes the defaults are good enough, right? But in this case, because there's like a lot of going on, Paul's finger actually can become a problem. Like his hand here is one thing, but then his finger pops in, and that kind of like confuse the software, right? Because it gets in the way, and it wants to stabilize the finger here as Paul's moving, right? You can see here how like the background looks kind of like all distorted. So what you want to do is simply say with the cropping, if you go up to 100%, and let's see, I remove the zoom, hit stabilize again to like redo all that. See, nothing is happening, right? There's no cropping, there's no whatever. Why? Because the cropping ratio is 1. That's 100%, meaning like you can see 100% of the image. So basically when you slide this thing down, what you're telling is that how much of the image do you want to see after the stabilization, right? So in other words, this is 100% of the image that you're gonna see. Obviously, like there's no cropping happening, so what's the point, right? If you go all the way down, then like you can see less of the image after the stabilization, right? Because there's gonna be a lot of cropping happening. It's gonna be like more cropping and so on and so forth. See, like there's a lot of cropping going on. What I like to do personally is I want to use the least amount of cropping. So say like a 0.95 or whatever. Maybe you can reduce the strength a bit, because let's start with that. It's just gonna reduce the cropping to a 0.95, right? Hit stabilize, and as you can see here, how much now it cropped less, right? Compared to this, see all this cropping that it did, because that's how much it's gonna zoom in into my footage here to crop out this stuff. Now this could be extreme, right? As you see here, so on and so forth, and you can see that like that's a lot of cropping that happens, right? So if I hit zoom, that's basically what happens. All this cropping gets cut off when you hit zoom over here. So now like when you play this back, that's all you're seeing. So that's basically what's happening here, right? But as you can see, it looks too strange, right? Too odd. So I don't want the warping to happen, so I'm gonna hit similarities, which basically is gonna like stabilize everything but not use warp stabilization, right? Also, I don't want that much cropping to happen, because I don't want to lose a lot of image, which is another thing you want to keep in mind. If like you're gonna stabilize, maybe you want to step back a bit and not zoom in too much, because you know for a fact that like the cropping is gonna happen when you use an image stabilizer, right? It's gonna zoom in on your footage a little bit. So if you know you're gonna do that and you don't want to lose too much of like your image footage here from the cropping of the stabilization, you want to step back a little bit and make sure you save yourself some like space for the cropping to happen when you're using image stabilization. So hit stabilize again, and I reduce the cropping ratio a little bit. So now like it should be better, and there should be less warpage happening. It's still too much, so again, actually you can play with these settings, right? It's too strong. Maybe gonna go like 0.2. I reduce like the strength of like the cropping. See, okay, what happened is mainly Paul's hand is jittery, and that's what's being stabilized. Not the footage, just like the jitter of Paul's hand, right? But that looks a lot better now. I just reduced like the strength a little bit, And you know, I just reduced the cropping, and that should help out. And as you can see here, it's looking a lot better. It's like less jittery now, right? But it looks a little more natural. Instead of having everything in the background look like it's like warping, like it's like jello, like it's underwater, right? We don't want that. In this example, I step back a bit, and then I step in to show you like this part. So using a stabilizer for all that can mess up your stabilization, because the computer is not going to know what you're doing. And it's going to like do a lot of like cropping, because I want to keep like the footage as stable as possible, right? So if I stabilize this with the default settings, it's stabilize, give that a while. And as you can see, basically it uses the resources better of like the CPU. DaVinci does a better job of stabilizing, that's for sure. If I play this back, if I uncheck zoom here, so you can already see how much of the cropping happens, right? So you can only see all that, and so on and so forth. And yeah, it does some like weird shit going on here. And this is like the using perspective. Oh, well, you can see that how extreme it went there to see that. But it does a good job because it keeps everything in focus, right? This is like the main focal area. So it does a good job of keeping everything steady, which is what we want. But as you can see, it's like it could be too extreme, right? And so I'm gonna zoom back to that area actually, because that's a good example. It's like right here, it wants to focus this area, but as you can see here, how much warpage, see that? Yeah, that's basically when you start to get your image to be distorted because it's warping. That's what like the perspective option is, and we don't want that. So I'm gonna go again with similarity, which is basically gonna like, it's gonna rotate, pan, and zoom a little bit, but it's gonna pan, tilt, and rotate the image to keep it stable, but it's not gonna use any like warpage, right? And also again, I want to use the least amount of like cropping, so 0.9 something's good, and I'm gonna reduce the strength a little bit just to make it more natural. Hit stabilize, and we can see over here most likely how much it's gonna change once it's done, and boom. All right, so you can see here how much that changed, right? There's like a less, you know, image is gonna get messed up. Also, like there's no warpage happening, so now it's gonna be more natural looking, right? And again, I uncheck the zoom just so you can see how much of the cropping is happening, right? And as you can see here, it looks a lot better. Everything's still working. Everything looking good. Still everything's being rotated. So yeah, there's less image cropping happening. So now if I check a zoom, if I play all that back, everything looks a lot more stable and it looks more natural, right? So you got to mess around with the strength settings and your cropping ratio, right? And it looks a lot more natural. And I mean, it's obviously still a handheld, but it's not as jarring as it was, where like, you know, everything looks like fucking jello and it's underwater. You know, it looks more natural, right? So that's where you need to learn to mess around with like the modes and the strengths here, right? Now for like the final example here, basically this is me when I go into Knott's Berry Farm, and this is me just handheld. Now for the most part, I use a lot of like hand stabilizer on my phone, and it does a good job itself. It does help, right? Or else this would have been more jittery. This is me walking with the hand stabilizer already activated on my phone, right? But then I added like the image stabilization. Now in this case is different. I actually went by default, which is the perspective and default settings, and I hit stabilize, and check that out. It looks really good, right? Now, if I want, because as you saw the difference, if I turn this off, you see how much image gets cropped out. And if I hit stabilize, you know, I zoom in too much. So again, this is where you can mess with the crop settings. So it doesn't crop out that much. Go down to 0.9, and there's more on my face now. And it looks still pretty good, right? You can tell it's like handheld, but it's not as smooth, but you're also not losing that much image, right? So you have to like pick your poison and what do you want to do, right? And it does a good job, and also you can sell like it. The main difference in this situation is that there's no zooming in and out with the camera. Everything is handheld from like one perspective, right? Everything is at a one image, like right here. So as I'm walking, it's almost like the same area. So it kind of helps to get a better stabilization, because as I'm walking, yeah, I'm walking, but I mean there's no like zooming in and out of my camera phone, right? Everything is like the same area. So that's what helps like image stabilization. That's what I was saying, like if you know you're gonna be using an image stabilizer, film knowing that you can be using an image stabilizer. So what you want to try to avoid is this. Try to avoid doing a lot of zooming in and zooming out when you're fucking like filming. Try to keep everything steady as possible and one distance, right? So when you're doing like the stabilization, it's gonna be worried about just stabilizing this, right? But still you'll want to hold it as steady as possible. And that's what happened here, right? I was able to stabilize it, but since like I'm not zooming in and out, it's able to like stabilize everything pretty well, and everything looks pretty good, right? Whereas like, you know, everything is jittery. You can see the difference, right? Yeah, it's pretty impressive, right? So now like, you know, if I select this part and see it's jittery, and just stabilize again, and then like, you know, everything looks good. Yeah, so DaVinci does a good job of stabilization, and like it does like a better job than Premiere Pro, that's for sure, and it's faster, which is I appreciate. But anyways, all right, so that's quite a video. So yeah, that's basically my image stabilization in a nutshell, and how you use it, when to use it, and like the different modes that's available for you to use. Right, you want to use the least amount of image stabilization when you're editing to avoid any kind of like weird distortion issues that happen. So yeah, when you're filming, definitely keep in mind that you are in fact going to use image stabilization. So film knowing that you could be using image stabilization, right? Definitely do it in that manner. So anyways, that's all I have to say. Hope this video helps. QR codes over here on the side if you really want to buy me a coffee. I really would appreciate that. Leave a like and leave me a comment if you guys have any questions, and I'll help you out, right? So yeah, hopefully this video helps you out. Thanks for hanging out with me for a bit. Take care and peace.